CNN's Jake Tapper did a segment that the Trump administration probably loves. This is about the UN overwhelmingly voting to denounce the recent Jerusalem announcement. So let's watch, and then I'll break it down.
Remember yesterday how United States Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley said the U.S. would be taking names of countries that supported a resolution critical of the Trump administration's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital? Well, let's hope Haley brought a lot of pens and paper, because 128 countries voted against the United States today, many of them U.S. allies. Only 9 countries voted with the U.S. There were 35 abstentions. Among the 128 countries that voted to condemn the U.S. on this issue were some countries with some rather questionable records of their own. Take Venezuela's representative today.
The world is not for sale. The world is not for sale, and your threats imperil global peace.
The U.S. imperils global peace, says the representative of Venezuela, a country in a humanitarian disaster, with violence in the streets, an economy in complete collapse, citizens malnourished, dying children being turned away from hospitals, starving families joining street gangs to scrounge for food. On what moral platform does the government of Venezuela stand today? Not to be outdone, of course, the U.S. also got an earful today from Syria. We're in the 7th year of the brutal Syrian civil war that has killed 500,000 people and displaced millions. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has used chemical weapons against his own citizens, including children. Also feeling a bit preachy today, Yemen, which helped draft the resolution condemning the U.S., seemingly more focused, at least during the speech, on where the U.S. puts its embassy in Israel than on the 7 million Yemenis on the brink of starvation in that country's civil war.
In light of the sensitive circumstances that our region is experiencing and which constitute a threat to international peace and security.
Yemen concerned with stability in the region. Interesting. There are plenty of policies and actions that are perfectly valid to criticize about the United States and about Israel, and certainly whether this move will help the peace process in any way seems one of them. But listening to these countries, including North Korea and Myanmar and Turkey and China, lecturing the United States in any way about human rights and peace might seem a bit much. But here is a bit of context that you might not know. According to UN Watch, which monitors the United Nations General Assembly from 2012 through 2015 has adopted 97 resolutions specifically criticizing an individual country. And of those 97, 83 of them have focused on Israel. That is 86%. Now, certainly Israel is not above criticism, but considering the genocide of the Rohingya people in Myanmar, the lack of basic human rights in North Korea, the children starving in the streets of Venezuela, the citizens of Syria targeted for murder by their own leader using the most grotesque and painful of weapons, you have to ask, is Israel truly deserving of 86% of the world's condemnation? Or possibly is something else afoot at the United Nations, something that allows the representative of the Assad government to lecture the United States for moving its embassy?
Just so we're clear, what he's doing there is heavily implying it's anti-Semitism. Oh, Israel, why do they get all this disproportionate hate? I mean, there's only one possible explanation, right? And of course, he's too chicken shit to just say it, because once he actually says it, well, then, he's on the record as saying it, and that's a notion that's pretty easy to disprove. So instead, you just heavily implied, it's got to be anti-Semitism, right? I mean, the world just hates the Jews, and that's why, God, they're so disproportionately, angry at them and mad at them, and they're disproportionately passing resolutions against them. So, I mean, look, I didn't say it was anti-Semitism. I just heavily implied it. That's weasel word bullshit from Jake Tapper right there. Now, let's dig into this. So first of all, notice that the whataboutism, so that's what that is. That's called whataboutism. When, the world criticizes the U.S. and Israel on human rights grounds and says, you can't fucking move the embassy and say the capital's Jerusalem, and this is not, like, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, the occupation, all this time, we weren't actually fighting against it, that was fake, and we think the occupation was okay, and now the ultimate prize is here. We're going to move the embassy to Jerusalem. I'm going to say Jerusalem is the undivided capital of Israel. Okay, even though it is literally divided. But no, we're going to say it's undivided and it's Jerusalem, so it's Israel's. So what Tapper's doing is he's saying, well, what about, you're criticizing Israel and the U.S.? Well, what about you? What about you? What about your human rights record? Let's talk about your fucked up human rights record. Now, the whataboutism never works the other way. So in other words, when the U.S. goes around the world and claims moral authority on every front, because the U.S. says, hey, we're the world's sole superpower, we care about human rights and freedom and liberty and democracy and all this stuff, he never says, well, hold on, what about all the things you've done, U.S.? He never does that. So the whataboutism only works in service of U.S. power. It never goes against it. He never goes, oh, you say you're caring about democracy. What about the fact that the U.S. supports 73% of the world's dictatorships? Looks to me like you don't care about human rights and you don't care about democracy. You're propping up 73% of the world's dictatorships. You can't make that case. He never goes, oh, the U.S. is claiming moral authority on this issue. Well, what about the fact that, hey, in Vietnam, you killed over 1 million innocent people? What about the Iraq War where you killed minimum 200,000 innocent people? What about torture? You just had a fucking torture scandal. You just had it. There was sleep deprivation. There was waterboarding. There was anal feeding, anal rape. They shove a tube up your ass and pump food up there. There's hypothermia torture, mock burials. People died as a result of this. Innocent people died as a result of this. Jake Tapper has never once said, who does the U.S. think they are to lecture the world about human rights when we just did an illegal war? We just did an illegal war. We just did torture. We have a mass surveillance program that takes everybody's information, which of course is a violation of the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, protection from unreasonable search and seizure. The whataboutism only goes in defense of U.S. state power. So that's called being drunk on American exceptionalism. Ignore our crimes. Now, he says he does the throwaway line, of course, because he doesn't want to look too ridiculous, where he says, well, of course, there's legitimate things to criticize the U.S. and Israel on, of course. Okay, then what are they? What are they, Jake? No, he doesn't answer that. Why? Because if he's being honest on that front, he'd say, of course, this is one of the things you can criticize the U.S. on. Okay, so the whataboutism only works to serve the U.S. They never do whataboutism to say, hey, what about the U.S. fucking up in all these ways? No. Now, he also brings up the example of Yemen, which is weird. Why are you bringing up Yemen as your example here of the rest of the world being fucked up when, guess what? Saudi Arabia is the real danger in that war. Saudi Arabia's bombing innocent women and children, bombing hospitals and schools and open-air markets and mosques. The Yemen's presence at the UN is like a shadow presence because that government isn't even in power in Yemen. So what are you fucking talking about? And we're arming them. We're arming Saudi Arabia, who's bombing the shit out of Yemen. What are you talking about? He's using Yemen as an example of like, other people have bad human rights records. When the U.S. and one of our top allies, Saudi Arabia, is committing atrocities right now in Yemen. That's a weird example to give. Like, other people have shitty human rights records, and my example of that is going to be a place where right now we have a shitty human rights record. That doesn't make any sense, Jake. But then, here's what's probably the most important point. That 86% stat that he gave is grossly misleading. So he's saying, hey, look, the UN goes after... they go after Israel way more than anybody else. I wonder why that could be. That's him saying, oh, it's because I hate the Jews. You know how irrational all these people are at the UN. Okay, but here's what he's not telling you. 86% is from the UN General Assembly. The UN General Assembly passes toothless resolutions that hinge on nothing. It doesn't mean anything. They're saying, yeah, we're against the illegal occupation. The UN Security Council, which is actually responsible and supposed to act to stop some of these things, passed a resolution critical of Israel before last year. When was the last time they did it? Fucking 2002. So, in other words, the UN is so biased against Israel that, number one, they're the ones who created it. Forgot to mention that little fact. Yeah, they hate this thing that they fucking created. And number two, they went over a decade without doing a critical resolution of Israel. So you have the UN General Assembly. It doesn't mean anything when they say, hey, slap on the wrist to you, Israel. And Jake Tapper's going, oh, look at all the fucking useless slaps on the wrist to Israel. Aren't they so anti-Semitic? And then where it actually matters, the UN Security Council, fucking 2002. That was when they were, and it was a both sides type, oh yeah, Palestine, Israel, it's equally bad, whatever, slap on the wrist in the UN Security Council. So think about that. Think about how disgustingly misleading that is. He's trying to say, I guess people are just anti-Semitic, by pointing to toothless resolutions in the UN General Assembly, ignoring the fact that the UN Security Council barely mentions Israel at all, and also, oh yeah, a little cherry on top. Hey, Jake, maybe the reason why they're getting a disproportionate attention in the UN General Assembly, even though it's toothless, is because they've been doing a fucking illegal occupation from 1967 and onwards. They keep expanding and expanding and expanding and taking more Palestinian land. It's illegal under international law. And so the UN is going, hey, don't stop, don't do that. The General Assembly is saying that. And he's like, oh, I guess you disagree with my illegal occupation simply because I'm Jewish. That's so hacky. That's so fucking hacky. You know what that is? That's the equivalent of a Salafi preacher in Saudi Arabia going, oh, I guess you hate Saudi Arabia because we're Muslim, you Islamophobe. No, we're not saying we hate Saudi Arabia because you're Muslim. We're saying you're Salafists, Wahhabists, which is extremist, fundamentalist Muslims who are oppressing people in your country. You say all atheists are terrorists. You know, you behead people for sorcery and witchcraft. You make women cover up from head to toe. That's why we're angry at you. Why the fuck would you disregard that context? Because you're a smear merchant and because you're a liar. And that's what Jake Tapper's doing here. So, ignore the fucking illegal occupation that's been going on endlessly. And hey, why is it they single out Israel, even though they don't in the UN General Assembly, which is the one that matters? Why is it they single out Israel? It must be something else at play. What a hack you are. You're such a fucking hack, Jake Tapper. He thinks he's so smart, but this is such a bullshit segment, and he knows it's bullshit. And by the way, curious, isn't it? So he loves to point out, hey, what about all these other people with bad human rights records? But notice, he doesn't mention the people who presumably do not have fucked up human rights records, who are against the U.S. and Israel on this. I mean, again, there were only 9 people who either abstained or voted against it. So, that means, so for example, Sweden, France, Jake, why aren't you going, hey, here are the people who presumably don't have fucked up human rights records who voted against the U.S. I wonder why they did that. Oh, it must be because of anti-Semitism, right, Jake? No, or it must be because people are saying, hey, you're doing an illegal occupation, you keep expanding more and more, you're killing any prospect for peace, and then as you do it the entire time, you point the finger at everybody else. So maybe there's actually something to this, Jake. But no. Just do propaganda for the U.S., do propaganda for Israel, obfuscate. That's what this is called, obfuscation. Obfuscate, deflect. It's just so pathetic. And this guy's a hashtag resistance leader. Hashtag resistance leader who's agreeing with Donald Trump on one of his core things that he did this month that's fucked up. This is the kind of resistance that you can expect from these clowns in corporate media. You'll hear them shriek about Russia, Russia, Russia all day long. You know, they'll go after Donald Trump for how he sips his water from a cup like a child. But on issues of substance that matter, like this, all of a sudden their hashtag resistance falls short and they kind of agree with him.